and welcome to the 7th Annual Policy Summit in Pursuit of Justice. I can't believe we've been doing this for 7 years. My name is Greg Torres. I chair the board of MassINC, and along with Kevin Burke, Max Stern, and Wayne Budd, one of the co-founders of the Massachusetts Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. Before we kick off today's program, I want to just say a quick thank you to our sponsors, the Shaw Foundation, the Boston Foundation, Community Resources for Justice, and our good friend, Al Koenig. Now, we have a great lineup for you today, and I can't wait to get to our keynote address and panel discussion. But first, we have a very special presentation to make, something we've never really done before. We've never created an annual award named after a former head of a branch of government. But when Chief Justice Gans died last year, we knew we had to do something to make a statement about the man, his leadership, his courage, his dedication to reform, and his willingness to confront institutional racism in the administration of justice. Now, many years ago, when the coalition began working to make the case for reform to public officials, we focused most of our efforts on the governor and the executive branch, the legislature and the various committees, the attorney general and so on, and tried to identify champions inside of the government that would take up the cause. But the leadership we were seeking came instead from an unlikely source, Chief Justice Gans. He was the first institutional leader to explicitly back comprehensive criminal justice reform when he called for sentencing reform, including ending mandatory minimum sentences, bail reform, and a renewed emphasis on reentry and reducing recidivism. We all remember what happened next. Senate President Rosenberg expressed his support a few months later, then Speaker DeLeo, and eventually the governor. But there was also a tremendous amount of blowback aimed at the chief. The truth is, it takes a certain amount of courage to go first. And it's the chief's courage and leadership that we celebrate in creating this award. The Ralph D. Gans Advancing Equitable Justice Award will be presented each year during subsequent summits to an individual or organization who furthers the chief's work and legacy. But today we present the first award to his family, and accepting on behalf of his family is his wife, Northeastern University professor of law, Deborah Ramirez. Now, those of you who knew Chief Gans well know that Professor Ramirez, Debbie to her friends, worked equally hard on criminal justice reform from outside the public arena as Ralph did on the inside. They met at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston, two brilliant young prosecutors appointed by Bill Weld. Thank you for that one, Governor. And they've been at it ever since. So I am honored to present this award to Debbie Ramirez, and I know I speak for everyone on this call in saying how much we admire Ralph Gans' contribution to the criminal justice world. So congratulations to you and your family, and please tell us how MassINC and the coalition can keep Ralph's legacy alive in years to come. Folks, please welcome Debbie Ramirez.
Morning. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today to accept this award on behalf of Ralph. If he were here, he would begin by thanking MassINC and all of you for leading the fight on criminal justice reform. And if he were here, he would also say, my time is over, but your time is now. And we need you at MassINC more than ever. He would tell you that his criminal justice reform work was not over, and that our ability to effect real criminal justice reform depends on our ability to reinvent the court's technology and leave behind the antiquated, paper-based filing and document system that currently exists. If you remember only one thing, remember this. Our ability to address this issue will define the future success or failure of the judiciary and of criminal justice reform. Now, as most of you know, on the day that Ralph died, he was working on the court's response to the Harvard Law School study on racial disparities in the Massachusetts criminal justice system. In 2016, Ralph asked Harvard researchers to look at the factors that are contributing to large racial disparity incarceration rates. Now, most of you know that in 2014, the Massachusetts Sentencing Commission found that Black people in Massachusetts were incarcerated at a rate 8 times that of white people, and Latinx people at 5 times that of white people. And that made us have an embarrassing distinction of outpacing national disparity rates. We rank highest in the country in terms of Latinx disparities, and 13th in the country in terms of Black disparities. What Ralph wanted to know was this: could we identify the factors that were causing those disparities? He said this: we need to learn the truth behind this troubling disparity. And once we learn it, we need the courage and the commitment to handle the truth. The report, as you know, looked at data from 2014 to 2016. It took 4 years to complete that study. On the day he received the report, he said, "I knew it. A big part of these disparities are the mandatory minimum sentences, which result in harsh initial sentencing decisions and longer sentences for Black and Latinx defendants." And the report could not explain those differences by differences in criminal behavior, prior criminal history, or any other relevant characteristics. He had testified about this before the legislature, and now he had the data. Or did he? Why did it take Harvard researchers 4 years to provide us with a statistical analysis of 2014 through 2016? Well, according to the authors of the report, data collection practices in Massachusetts create significant barriers to measuring racial disparities in all stages of the criminal justice system. We have a paper-based system with manila files. This is what they had to work with. The researchers had to find and collect these pieces of paper, and the documents were scattered all over in various locations. The files were in the probation office. The files were in the police department. The files were in the district attorney's offices, and the files were in the court. These paper files are hard to locate and not online. Every district attorney had a different system for tracking cases. And when a case moved from district court to superior court, they were not linked. Race and ethnicity were recorded differently in different agencies. Lots of data was missing, unusable, or not provided. Pretrial events and non-jail sentencing data were not consistently recorded electronically. Here's the bottom line: we do not have a comprehensive, standardized online tracking system for criminal or civil cases. To do this report, researchers and court employees had to collect thousands of pieces of this paper files, piece them together, stitch them together, and figure out what happened and why. And even after that, we now only have an imperfect and incomplete picture of the factors that led to the racial disparities between 2014 and 2016. Researchers were only able to find all the pieces of paper for 4,000 cases ending in final conviction, or about 3% of total convictions. But it is now 4 years later. And during those 4 years, we implemented bail reform. District Attorney Rollins decriminalized some nonviolent criminal offenses. We've been diverting nonviolent cases on the front end rather than sending folks to jail. Is it working? We don't know. What effect have these changes had on mass incarceration and racial disparities? How would we know? We do not have a computer-based management system that would allow researchers, state officials, judges, DAs, or probation to track information on an aggregate basis. Any analysis has to be done manually. We are all flying blind. We have absolutely no way to know if the factors identified between 2014 and 2016 still exist. Have they exacerbated, diminished, or disappeared? We don't know. To find out that answer, we would have to commission another study. We'd have to wait another 4 years. And then we might have an incomplete statistical picture of 3% of the cases from 2020 or 2021. No system can operate this way. If it takes us 4 years to find out what is wrong with 3% of cases ending in conviction in our system, we are never going to be able to fix it. As any first-year business management student knows, to know what to do, you have to know what's going on. Where should we be directing our attention? Data helps us identify problems and design solutions. And once we implement solutions, we need to know this. Are they working? We cannot possibly fix what we can't measure. And right now, we can't measure anything. We cannot know the current factors contributing to mass incarceration or racial disparities because we have no system-wide data to enable us to identify the appropriate factors and measure them. And so here is my plea to you. I hope MassINC will take this issue on. This is an access to justice issue. This is a criminal justice reform issue. This is a public health issue. It's an access to justice issue because right now lawyers are spending up to 8 hours a day searching for their client's file, these paper files over here, in family court and other court. Judges are deciding cases that other judges have already decided because the clerks haven't yet filed the paper decision in the paper file. And since we have no e-filing, clerks are still pushing mounds of paper documents. Staffers are entering data by hand into computer systems that don't talk to each other. And most sadly, today and every day, judges in our district courts and superior courts must physically go to court, endangering their health during a pandemic because they need these paper files located in the clerk's offices in order to conduct virtual hearings. While we have the finest judges in the country, our courts, in terms of technology, e-filing, and creating a paperless document and management system, we are in the bottom half of all state courts in the country. Just as MassINC has led all of us on past issues of criminal justice reform. It is my hope that everyone here today and MassINC lends your voices of support to this enterprise. We need to ask the legislature and the governor to pass the $163 million bond for technology assistance to the courts over the next 7 years. And we need to speak out to the globe, to newspapers, at conferences, to anyone who will listen about how this system affects users, poor people, criminal justice reform, and the need for transparent, standardized, systemic electronic data. What we need now is the kind of leadership that MassINC has always provided. So if you want to honor Ralph, honor his legacy by helping the courts to finish the work he started. Pick up this baton and carry it forward. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic, Debbie. Thank you so much. Woo. And thank you for those kind words about MassINC and the coalition. As I said to you privately recently, we couldn't have done any of the things we've done without you and without Ralph. So thank you for that. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for the reminder of our unfinished business on reform. And finally, thanks for the inspiration to keep at it. And I assure you, everybody on this call, particularly after your remarks, will keep at it. So thank you. Now, I would like to shift gears and introduce District Attorney Rollins to do our keynote address. It's going to be a very brief introduction because she really needs no introduction to this crowd. Everybody knows what District Attorney Rollins has been doing. And but I will introduce her by saying Rachael Rollins keeps her word. What do I mean by that? When she ran for office, she laid out a reform agenda that she intended to implement if she were fortunate enough to be elected district attorney. That agenda was very detailed and it was very controversial. And it's the kind of agenda that when a politician eventually is fortunate enough to gain a powerful office, that sometimes gets dissipated, sometimes gets watered down in the process. That didn't happen with Rachael Rollins. She laid out exactly what she was going to do. The minute she got in office, she started implementing that agenda. All hell broke loose in some quarters. It didn't matter. She just kept going forward. That, in my experience, particularly over the last 10 years, when I watch electeds run on a certain platform and then get there, this to me is unique. So I just wanted to introduce Rachael by saying we have a Suffolk County District Attorney who keeps her word. So please welcome Rachael Rollins.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you all for the invitation to be here and to have this important discussion. I want to begin in an unconventional way for a lawyer. I want to begin by talking about science. Charles Darwin once wrote, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, but the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change." I spend a lot of my time talking about change, the possibility of change, the need for change, the urgency for change. But change from what? Change to what? The first question is easier. We want to leave behind a system that favors wealth, power, and privilege over justice, equality, and accountability. We reject a system that criminalizes poverty, housing insecurity, substance use disorder, and mental illness. We denounce a system that prioritizes finality over justice, retribution over rehabilitation. We condemn a system where your race and class are predictive of your likelihood of arrest and conviction. The system has failed too many, and it has failed too often. It has failed generation after generation. And we know it doesn't work. Broken windows theory has and will always be broken. It is successful only in ensuring the over-policing of Black and Brown communities without an increase, poor Black and Brown communities, without an increase in safety or a decrease necessarily in violence. We know that frequent interactions with law enforcement, and communities of color, overwhelmingly Black and Brown communities, have spurred the epidemic of violence against Black lives, a story as old as our nation's founding. We know that tough on crime policies do not keep us safer, and they do not make the United States the lead, and they do, in fact, make the United States the leader in mass incarceration. We need to change, and we know we need to, but how we do, in how we change has to ensure that we are better. Again, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is the most adaptable to change. The key word in that quote is not change, it's adaptable. We must be able to adapt, and if we don't, we are doomed to fail. Chief Justice Gans knew that. Professor Ramirez reminds us of that. And I'm here to tell you that without comprehensive real-time data, we will continue to fail. And not just failing in an abstract, academic, or theoretical way, failing in a way that costs us lives, destroys communities, and exacerbates inequalities. Reliable, readily available data is how we evolve, how we adapt, and how we ensure that we are smart on crime. Professor Ramirez is absolutely right. The lack of a comprehensive, standardized online tracking system is detrimental to any district attorney's office to function effectively and efficiently. But I want to explain just how detrimental. So ADAs in my office spend anywhere from 4,000 to 8,000 hours transcribing data from paper documents into paper case file jackets each year. Our administrative staff then spends 5,000 to 10,000 additional hours retranscribing much of that same data and more from those case file jackets into our computer database. I want that to sink in. 9,000 to 18,000 hours a year manually inputting data. In addition to the massive waste of human capital, we are also more vulnerable to human limitations and errors. Because of the demanding caseloads, my staff often have to triage tasks, and almost always this means that stacks of case files waiting to be entered manually will have to wait when a distraught person who has been victimized walks in, an attorney calls with a question about a case, or a courthouse closes due to COVID, things that are happening every single day. This results in frequent backlogs of cases waiting to be transcribed, causing lags between the time events and trends occur, and when me and my staff become aware of it. And let's not forget that every time a staff member transfers data from paperwork to file jacket, from file jacket to computer database, like the game of telephone, we risk incorrect transcription. So the data we do have is prone to inaccuracies, incomplete, and comes with significant lag times that inhibit our ability to identify public safety trends in real time. And that's only the data we do have. What about the data we don't have? What are the costs of not having that data at our fingerprints? I ran on a campaign to fundamentally reform our criminal legal system. One of my first policy initiatives was a list of 15 low-level crimes that would presumptively be declined to prosecute or diverted into community-based programs. It was a rebuttable presumption, but we were going to flip it from incarceration, usually, or prosecution, to the reverse of a presumptive declination or diversion. Is that policy working? Should we change the list to include fewer offenses, more offenses? I've been asking this question for almost 2 years. We know for sure that in 2019, we dismissed, declined, and diverted an unprecedentedly low number of low-level nonviolent offenses. Crime trend data tells us that this did not coincide with large increases in crime in Boston, Chelsea, Revere, and Winthrop during that same year. We brought in a team of academic researchers to look at our data over time, and they found that non-prosecution of minor misdemeanor cases results in significantly fewer future arraignments and prosecutions. This is all good news, but what if we want to look at those people who had their cases dismissed, declined, or diverted by my office to see if anyone subsequently committed a violent offense during the violent crime spike in 2020 due to COVID? To do this analysis, we would have to run a manual record query for each individual person one by one. This would take additional thousands of hours we simply do not have. We have the same problem if we want to track the outcomes of persons the SJC authorized for presumptive pretrial release due to COVID. We are unable to quickly or easily evaluate crime and recidivism trends that may or may not be resulting from policy changes because we don't have the real-time electronic data sharing with partner agencies envisioned in the 2018 statute. The end result is that we are working completely in the dark to the detriment of our collective public safety. This frustration is not limited to just our office, my office. Chief Justice Gans commissioned the Harvard study in order to gain the kind of precise data necessary to enact meaningful reform to a problem he and I and anyone who has been paying attention to our criminal legal system knows: race matters. But what are the inflection points? Where do these biases, inequalities manifest? Where and when does the law fail to provide equal treatment? One hypothesis is that it happens at the plea bargaining stage. The Harvard report examined whether Black and brown defendants were offered harsher pleas than white defendants, but couldn't ascertain exactly how much harsher because of the lack of data from the district attorneys. When I asked my staff if we had this data readily available, they said yes, but not in our database. Rather, this info is sitting in paper files and boxes inside a warehouse. Racial inequities are exacerbated and perpetuated by our lack of coordinated effort to collect and share data that oversight agencies need to identify racial, ethnic, gender, and other biases. The Harvard study researchers repeatedly made note of this glaring obstacle and how it contributed to their inability to identify clearer cause and effect conclusions because the data they had access to was incomplete or insufficient. This is true. Police departments would not or could not provide the researchers with aggregated arrest reports. District attorneys either would not or could not share vital information, such as when they reduced charges or dropped cases. The trial court does not electronically track bail amounts or fines and other penalties, including probation, the most common sanction. They also don't collect information on judges to analyze sentencing disparities from courtroom to courtroom, courthouse to courthouse. Across agencies, case records lack a common identifier to track individuals through the system, and there are no unified standards for recording race and ethnicity consistently. The state still does not capture gender and other records, a person's sex, and only records a person's sex assigned at birth. As the researchers struggled to complete the commissioned report, criminal legal advocates, civil rights leaders, and legislators tried to address this massive roadblock to reform. In 2018, they successfully championed extensive data reporting requirements in a landmark criminal justice reform bill. It is now law that all police departments must release quarterly arrest reports. Agencies must standardize electronic data collection and track individuals using a single common identifier. The Executive Office of Public Safety and Security must integrate records across agencies and provide de-identified race and other data for analysis. 2 years later, however, my office still receives paper copies of documents, even though our partner agencies store that same data electronically. This lack of compliance and our inability to have precise, comprehensive data comes with costs. It has an efficiency cost because my staff is forced to manually input data that already exists electronically elsewhere. It has a public safety cost because we cannot identify many crime trends in real time, and as a policy cost because we cannot adapt our policies to meet the needs of the community. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. We need to adapt as if our lives depended on it, because they do. We need every stakeholder involved to treat this lack of data sharing as if it were their loved ones who were incarcerated, as if we were failing them and their families, because we are failing families and communities throughout our state. We need the governor to appoint someone to lead EOPS who will actually champion this cause, aggressively pursue it to completion, and bring on the right people and resources to do it correctly. We need to embrace technology, not clutch to outdated and inefficient systems that were instituted because they were the only means available. We actually have options. We have a duty to choose the most efficient and effective option available. We need the legislature to demand action and compliance. If EOPS or any other agency are facing any obstacles that prevent them from implementing the law more than 2 years later, they should identify those obstacles. If it is a matter of funding, then the legislature should appropriate the necessary funds. If agencies continue not complying, the legislature should consider a rigid timeline for implementation with penalties. And I would go so far as to say 2 years, there should be no more time. I have personally committed to this, all of these issues. On day one, I created a new position in my office called the Chief of Innovation and Strategy, and then immediately hired a data technologist who had done significant data analysis for the ACLU. I use data in all of my public remarks in town halls. Another thing I implemented on day one, actually going out into the community and speaking to them about what our office was doing and hearing from them about how we can do it better. And most recently, I just signed a data use agreement with Felix Awosu to assist my office with data analysis. Felix, of course, is the co-author of the Harvard Disparities report that Professor Ramirez mentioned and Chief Justice Gans commissioned. I want to thank Felix and Dr. Sandra Susan Smith for empowering and funding researchers to work alongside public interest organizations like my office so we can be better. Chief Justice Gans believed that criminal justice reform was an urgent mandate, not a mere aspiration. Change demands actions, but we can't act on instinct. We must act on data. We must adapt in order to survive. If not, we will continue to be as broken windows, just as outdated as the 1994 crime bill. We will be another chapter in the story of American dysfunction and systemic oppression. I believe that this is the fight of our generation. Data is the tool we need to adapt to change. Without it, we are doomed to fail. With it, we can begin to work to ensure justice in our criminal legal system. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for those inspirational remarks. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I know you had a crazy schedule, so thank you for doing that. So now let's turn to the panel. I'm going to introduce Shira Schoenberg, who is a reporter with Commonwealth Magazine. Shira previously worked for more than 7 years at the Springfield Republican and MassLive.com, covering state politics and elections, as well as topics like the legal marijuana industry and the state's foster care system. Shira, thank you for being there. I'll leave it to you to introduce the panel. So take it away, Shira.
Thank you so much, Greg. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this discussion on rooting out racial bias in the criminal justice system. We're going to talk for the next 45 minutes about racial disparities, and in particular, the important role that data plays in identifying these disparities. We're also going to discuss the problems with Massachusetts' collection of this data, as you heard so pointedly from Professor Ramirez and DA Rollins. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here this morning. Felix Awosu is a doctoral candidate in public policy at Harvard who studies issues of race and policing. As a research fellow at Harvard Law School's Criminal Justice Policy Program, he helped write the landmark study conducted for the SJC on racial disparities in the Massachusetts criminal justice system. He also works as a data scientist for the Washington DC Police Department. Dr. Michaela Rabinowitz is Director of Data, Research, and Analytics at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. Previously, she was Director of National Engagement and Field Operations for Measures for Justice, where she worked with policymakers to improve data collection in criminal justice. Carrie Collins is Undersecretary for Forensic Science and Technology within the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. She oversees several state agencies, including the Department of Criminal Justice Information Services, and was previously General Counsel at the State Police Crime Lab and a Middlesex County prosecutor. Representative Liz Miranda is a state representative for the 5th Suffolk District, which includes Roxbury and Dorchester. She's worked on policing reform, improving racial disparities in maternal health, and fighting for a COVID recovery that helps small businesses and people of color. She previously worked in youth development and violence prevention, and her family has been personally affected by incarceration. So before we get into all these discussions about data and statistics, Representative Miranda, I'd like to start with you to hear about people. The district you represent is 94% people of color. What do these disparities mean to families and communities, and how do these families view the correction system?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I want to echo the sentiments of the very powerful women who went ahead of me and Mr. Torres, that it's quite an honor to be here today. I represent the 5th Suffolk District. It is a community that is 94% of color, where 50% of the people in that community are foreign born. It is my home. I'm also a woman who has been in the legislature only 26 months, but I've been a Black woman from Roxbury my entire life. I was 9 years old the first time I realized that my sibling was going to jail, and spent most of my teen and college years visiting, writing, not only my siblings, but my father, who was also incarcerated. I am the only legislator in a current body of 200 people that has a sibling in the DOC system, a father and brother who were deported, and one of two, and we happen to both be Black women who've lost a sibling to gun violence. We are the most over-policed, over-incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth, and that is not by accident. I want to take a moment to read a quote by Frederick Douglass that led me to do my work, where it says, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." I say that quote because one important piece about the 5th Suffolk District, it is also the 3rd most dangerous sort of zip code or area in the Commonwealth, behind Boston as a city, Springfield as a city. And so we have one neighborhood that is over-policed, over-incarcerated, disproportionately poor, disproportionately of color, and we're still not safe. So incarceration, trauma, and criminal justice system have been with me my entire life. And when DA Rollins was talking about generations, people that are incarcerated are not throwaway people. They have families, they have stories, and we're leaving in Massachusetts another generation behind. We make up Black and brown people only 20% of the Commonwealth or less, but we make up 70% of our jails and prisons. So when we're waiting 4 years for data, it has a human toll. It's a justice issue, it is an equity issue, and it's a race issue. And I'm happy to be a part of the legislature now because we're gonna hold everyone accountable, including ourselves.
And the legislature did act, as we all know, in 2018 to pass that landmark criminal justice reform bill that tried to reduce some of these disparities. For example, it diverts minor offenses out of the criminal justice system, minimizes the chances for juveniles to enter the justice system. Representative Miranda, given some of these data limitations, do we know if criminal justice reform has been successful?
We don't. And one of the things I just want to go back to highlight what you said. So in 2018, we passed this landmark legislation. I wasn't in the legislature at the time. We required state officials to create a comprehensive cross-tracking system where every person entering the criminal justice system would be assigned a number, and their case documents from arrest to sentencing and beyond would be maintained in an online system. That system would be designed to share information between every agency. That's important. Every agency in the criminal justice system including prosecutors, judges, and jails, to make some anonymized information available also for research. What's clear, that has not happened. We need the money to do it. And the biggest problem I see with this situation is that although we passed a bill that did a lot of great things, and I just want to commend folks like Representative Claire Cronin, Senator Bill Brownsberger, and Senator Jamie Eldridge, we passed that bill in 2018, and it's 4 years later, and we still do not have the information we need. And what we do not measure, we cannot address. And it's incredibly important, particularly for a community like myself, where people are sitting on probation and parole. We've read the Harvard report that has told us that people disproportionately, particularly if they're Black or brown, get sentenced longer sentences. We have a crisis. And unless we get this data situation figured out, the state legislature really needs to put pressure on the executive branch. And I'm here today to say we have all the information we need. Communities like mine are tired of hearing bad news. And unless we want to continue to be the most incarcerated country in the world, we have to do something about this immediately.
So Felix, we've all been talking about how we read this report by the Harvard Law School that was given to the SJC on racial disparities. You wrote the report. So tell us, first of all, just give us some highlights, or I guess I might say lowlights. How extreme are these racial disparities in our criminal justice system? And were you able to pinpoint at which point in the criminal justice system these disparities get introduced? Is it at arrest, at trial level, at sentencing? What did you discover?
Yeah, sure. Thank you guys for having me. Honored to be here. And I appreciate all of the words that have been said about the importance of this kind of work. I agree. I will give you guys a very quick overview of some of the top line results. I think first and foremost, one thing that's been spoken to is the racial disparities that we see and document in the report in sentencing and things like that. Those occur over a backdrop of overrepresentation. So whenever we talk about people getting longer sentences, for example, or being more likely to be detained pre-trial, that's also on top of being more likely to be in the system at all. I think that speaks to policing, that speaks to what's going on in our communities. And so people of color are substantially overrepresented within the system, which then goes on to treat them harsher than similarly situated white people in the system. So I just wanted to make that clear first, that I think the disparities really begin outside of the criminal justice system in our communities. And many of the disparities are baked in by the time that somebody shows up in a court database that we'd be analyzing in our report. But then beyond that, once you see people in the court database, I think the most stark finding was that people of color are getting much longer sentences. If you look at people who are incarcerated, Black people are on average getting 168-day longer sentences. For Latinx people, it's 148 days longer. That's a much longer time just looking at how long people are going away in response to these cases. We accounted for a lot of different factors and decision points, and the things that really stuck out as I think leading to these big disparities are weapons offenses and drug offenses. The disparities were particularly stark there. And so we see people of color being more likely to be facing those charges, which again, I think goes back to policing and what's going on in our communities. But then even if you compare them to white people who are facing those same kinds of charges, so white people facing weapons charges or drugs charges, people are getting much longer sentences in those cases. Mandatory minimum offenses, offenses that carry mandatory minimum incarceration time also played a big role that we found. The decision to indict or not to indict was another decision point that I think played a big role. It's one that is often discretionary. And we found that people of color are more likely to be indicted, sent to more serious courts where longer penalties are available, and then thus face longer sentences. So I think it's really throughout the system, and even before people enter the criminal justice system at all, that these disparities are occurring. And we saw that kind of tracks throughout the entire pipeline.
And your study is also quoted as kind of example number one of the just total lack of good data in our criminal justice system. What were some of the biggest problems that you found with the data that exists?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were definitely hampered in some of the things that we believed to be most important and we wanted to look at, but we were not able to because of data. I think one thing that was brought up by District Attorney Rollins was thinking about this, what's going on with the plea bargaining process, what plea offers are being made, what are people actually being convicted of. So we saw, differences in initial charging, which is, I think, pretty well documented. But most cases are decided through plea bargains where the charges can be reduced or changed, right? Differences in that element of discretion, what offers are made and accepted, I think plays a big role here. We weren't able to document that because we didn't see final conviction charges. We just saw what was sort of entered at the beginning of the process and then the sentences that came out at the end. I think Professor Ramirez also mentioned that for only a small number of cases, we were able to actually get some of that final sentencing data, that 3%, where we were able to see how people were sentenced for those convictions. That was a sleuthing exercise where we had to basically ping several agencies and say, can we fill in the gaps? Can we find a creative workaround to try and provide some insight here? Because it's an important question, but it's just not tracked well. I think that's data that we got 3 years into the process, right? After having tried to think about what are the workarounds. And that's part of what made things take so long, is seeing what was there and then seeing what we had to do beyond that to expand the picture and bring in new sources. So we're able to, for example, look at incarceration data to get sort of a measure of charges at the end, but that's a small number of people who are being incarcerated. Many of the people who are facing lower level offenses might not be incarcerated, but be facing fines, pretrial detention, and other things that are very impactful. We weren't able to speak to that in as much detail. So I think there were multiple elements of this process that were opaque to us, but are very impactful, and in other research have been shown to be sort of big drivers of this that we weren't able to speak to as much as we would like.
And Undersecretary Collins, circling back to this cross-tracking system that Representative Miranda talked about, the 2018 law required the state to set up this tracking system where everyone who enters the criminal justice system would be given a number, and then all of the documents that related to that person would be tagged with a number so that their case could be tracked throughout the system when they go from arrest to trial to jail to probation or whatever the trajectory is of their case. The data could also be anonymized and used to learn about things like racial disparities by researchers. So it's been 2.5 years since the law passed. What progress has actually been made on implementing this system?
Thank you, Shira, and thank you for the opportunity to present. I really do appreciate it, as does Secretary Turco. From everything that we've heard here this morning, we all know that the quality of data is important. And this is very important to Secretary Turco. It's important to all of us. And that is not lost on us that we are into 2021 without a cross-tracking system. We are not where we want to be, and we understand that. And we're working hard to get to where we want to be. And what we've talked about here is the importance of quality of data. And that's something that our working group, when we first started tackling developing regulations, developing standardized data for criminal justice agencies to collect, we looked at how do we get quality data. And one of the requirements of the criminal justice reform was that SID, which, for if most folks don't know, the SID, that is done when somebody is fingerprinted. And that is that unique identifying number that tracks an individual throughout the criminal justice system. So I believe when we first started, our group was looking at data quality and how could we get to that good data. And as most folks should know, it is not required in the law in Massachusetts to be fingerprinted. So what we found early on is how do we get that good quality data so that we could make sure that the data that the researchers are relying upon was something that could be trustworthy. So I believe that our group struggled with that. We struggled early on, and I think that we got mired and bogged down with those details. And once we were able to rely upon the Justice Reinvestment Board and their members, and personally speaking with the members and seeking their input, seeking their advice, we also reached out to the Department of Corrections. We reached out to the Sheriff's Agency to get their insight as to how we could put together our regulations so that we could capture the data that was necessary. And what we found was in defining these terms, we realized that some of these terms are used differently. Most importantly, with the sentencing guidelines, the governing offense is defined differently than how the Department of Corrections uses the governing offense. So we looked at how we could define these terms to get good quality data. And then where's this data coming from? That's the other piece that we struggled with that we are still working through. There are 13 sheriff's departments with the Department of Corrections and with parole. So it's kind of like a big puzzle. We started looking at the puzzle and trying to figure out, how do we put all these pieces together? And for most of you, you start on the corners. And I think that that was what we started looking at, is how is it that we can take this puzzle, take the pieces and look at how we could put them together. And we struggled with that, but we are working towards getting the system to a point where folks know that we are working on this, and this is very important to us. So I think that it's that data quality that we struggle the most with, but the technology piece as well, and working with the Executive Office of Technology, Safety and Security as well, to develop that system that we all want for that good quality data.
So practically, are we at a point today where we have that standardized data? And what's the time frame? How long will it take to get that next technology piece up and running, or even to get a proposal for that next technology piece?
We don't have standardized data now, and that's something that we are working with all of the agencies to get that standardized data. Because one thing we found, Shira, that these agencies, they want good data. They want to get the data out to this community, understanding, especially what Professor Ramirez was saying, what Representative Miranda and DA Rollins have been saying, is that there's a definite need for this good quality data, and each of these agencies want to give that good data. It's to synthesize it and get it together to be able to do that. And that's starting with the regulations that we hope to promulgate in the next coming months. And then working with each of these agencies to be able to change their systems to collect the data. If you think about it, each of these systems, in the mindset, the philosophy before with collecting data was to decide, to see who's in your population. Now with the shift is looking at this data from a research perspective and how this could help researchers identify trends, identify exactly what Representative Miranda was saying, what DA Rollins is saying, that need for that good quality data. That's a cataclysmic shift in how data is collected, and that's what we're also working on. But I can tell you, this is extremely important. We understand it's a tough position to be in, to be here to tell you that it's not done, but we hope over the next year, you're going to see significant progress, because we have talked to companies about how we could display the data now before we get to that full integrated system. But we know the importance of this data, and we're trying our best to get this out as soon as we can.
Dr. Rabinowitz, Measures for Justice is dedicated to standardizing the collection of criminal justice data and helping states collect data. So from a racial justice perspective, why is it important to have good data and to know what's happening at each step of the system?
Thanks so much, Shira. That's a great question. And to be honest, I would go back to Felix's response when we talked to this, which is that we know that when we look at the end, and that's often the place where there is the most data, is when we look at departments of corrections, we see these insane racial disparities in every single state in this country. But really the question is, how do we identify the junctures where we can make active policy and practice interventions? And in order to do that, we have to look at the decisions that are made at every step that precedes that in the process. So what is the decision made around when to arrest someone for a particular conduct? What is the decision made about whether and how to charge that person versus to decline to charge versus to divert that person? What is the decision being made around bail determination, and how does that inform pretrial detention? What are the decisions being made around when and whether and when to use it to enhance charges based on the kind of conduct or the location of the conduct or other factors? And all of these small decisions that are really just kind of part of the daily process of criminal justice are the things that exacerbate racial disparities at every step along the way. And while we know this, and there is a body of research that does show this, at the very small practice level of the people who are responsible for making the criminal justice system operate, we need to be able to see those specific junctures in those specific jurisdictions to inform the kinds of policies that inform the decisions of law enforcement, of prosecutors, of judges, of public defenders, et cetera, throughout.
And we've all been talking about Massachusetts, but you've obviously looked at this from a national lens. What are other states doing in terms of standardizing data? Have any other states established a cross-tracking system like the one Massachusetts is trying to do?
So I would say that in the last 5 years, we've seen a huge uptick in interest in starting to do this kind of work. So there are a number of states that are in the process of trying to do so. One thing I would say to make folks in Massachusetts feel better is that the challenges that Massachusetts is experiencing are very common. They're being experienced everywhere. So Florida passed probably the most comprehensive criminal justice data law, also in 2018, requiring the collection of data from all criminal justice agencies across the process be reported to a central state agency where those data could be matched, linked, that anonymized for public use. Florida, it's still sort of similar to Massachusetts. It's a work in progress. But I think Carrie in many ways hit the nail on the head when she said it comes down to the regulations. So it's easy to pass a law that says we do this, but then to really figure out the nuanced details of what does that mean? How do we establish those processes by which the data are received? How do we ensure that the data are standardized in a way that really allow us to use those things, even down to really basic things like, is every single criminal justice agency in the state using tracking the statutory code in the same way? Or is someone using dots and someone else is using commas and someone else is using parentheses, and then all of a sudden you can't link offenses across, you can't compare offenses across counties. So the other states that I would say we've seen doing this work, New Jersey passed a landmark criminal justice data bill just in 2020. They're probably the very early stages of implementation since that just passed. And then the other movement that we've seen around the criminal justice data transparency has been really focused on prosecution specifically. So Connecticut and Connecticut and Utah being the two states that have recently passed prosecutorial data transparency bills. In some ways that's a much simpler endeavor because they're only trying to collect data from one type of criminal justice practitioner versus trying to collect it from law enforcement and prosecution and courts and everybody else, which is obviously just a massive undertaking.
So it's good to know that we're not in our struggles. To make the case, why is it in the interest of these state agencies to collect and make available good data?
First I would argue that the function of the state agencies is to serve the populace who live in that state. And so this is frankly just a good governance and good public policy practice that the state agency should be responsive to the people whose taxes fund their operations, and the people in the state whose taxes fund the operations of the criminal justice system have a right to know what is happening.
And Felix, I'll call you back up because you were obviously been on the ground here in Massachusetts. What did you experience when you dealt with all the agencies here in Massachusetts for your study of disparities?
So I think,
were agents.
Oh, sorry, you're cutting out a little bit. I just wanted to make sure you would finish your question. Let me jump in a little bit. So, okay. So I think in Massachusetts, our experience was unique in that having, I think, buy-in from the SJC and Chief Justice Gans really opened doors that would not have been open. And so I think my experience may be one that was smoothed over by that, in that there was a lot of cooperation. I think there was a lot of willingness there, but there were structural barriers in terms of what could be provided and how. And so I think this goes back to that distinction between data that's being used operationally day to day, and then making that transition to making it available for research. People who are entering this might actually only need to be looking at one case. And so it might not be the end of the world if things are not standardized across different fields. But I remember, for example, with bail, one thing that came up is the way that a lot of that information is captured is a free text field. And so there's information that can be interpreted, but going through 550,000 cases, which may have several different movements per person involved in that case, and trying to sort of make sense of open text is a much, much bigger lift than if you had a variable that says like, this is what the bail amount was, or things of that nature. And so I think there was, that disconnect there in terms of what is being used or how things are being used for day-to-day work and how things are being used for research. But I think the overall culture was, I was seeing that there was a sense of other people wanted these things too, or recognize that would be great if we could answer these kinds of questions. But the process from getting to point A, or from point A to point B, is not obvious. One of the things that I worked on in my role in DC was, complying with a very similar kind of community request, more focused on policing, but for better transparency, data integration across different systems, and things of that nature, to be able to figure out people who are facing traffic stops versus all those other kinds of stops and put them together to analyze whether there's racial disparities in how people are being detained by police. And that was, you would think just policing, but again, a multi-agency process. And there was one that was, I think, fomented by the community and that direct sort of request in terms of legislation, but then filtering through, I think it really just like, there's a concrete work that has to get done and concrete investments that need to be made. And if those things aren't happening, then any sort of goodwill or sort of willingness to help on the side of the staff, many of whom were invaluable to making our research possible and answered incessant questions that we would ask, like that doesn't necessarily cut it if those concrete investments aren't there. And so I think that's like one of the things that I took away from this, is that you have to have being able to use this as an input to policy as your goal. That requires different kinds of things than being able to use this to manage your individual caseload, say, as a lawyer. Those are just different tasks, and you need different systems to reach those tasks. And until we sort of come with that from the beginning and think about those questions as we're coming up with our data systems, we're not going to magically arrive at a system that lets us answer those questions. That does take intentionality.
And do state agencies have an interest in creating systems that are accessible to researchers? Because it seems like until now, the state agency's goal has really been to create the systems they need to manage their own population. Why should they create this broader system?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels of, interest as well, right? I think there's certainly people within every state agency that I've interacted with who recognize the need for this, right? Do those people say wield the power, or do they sort of think about the strategic direction of those agencies? Are they there for the long term or the short term? Like, is that work kind of persistent once it gets started? These are things that can take years to happen, right? So I think there's definitely interest and goodwill to be found to make these kinds of things happen in every agency that at least that I've come in contact with. I think one thing that has been instrumental in, I think, pushing this forward in context where I've seen it move forward is showing the impact that the research can have when the data are made available, right? And so being able to actually, evaluate whether something worked and make a concrete decision that we should expand this, or that we should scale back funding for this because it's not delivering the results that we want, right? Being able to actually have it touch people's lives, right, I think is a thing that builds momentum. So we can write reports, and I think think the reports are super valuable. I think many of the people here think that's valuable. But I think once it's valuable to the person who doesn't follow criminal justice policy, but sees that their community is getting better in a measurable or concrete way, and sees this as an input to that, I think that leads to the momentum that it takes. And I think that needs to happen to people inside and outside, right? Somebody who's working in the system, I think, I have 10 things I need to do. And, data entry or like reorganizing our entire data system that's going to take some of my team offline, that's providing direct services, like that's a choice that I have to make. And it's not obvious to me that that's a trade-off, that I should be taking time away from providing some sort of direct service and doing my work in the community to think about a long-term data project that might take 5 years to bear fruit. But we're going to be in the same position in 5 years if we don't make that investment now. And so I think like it's kind of hard, and there's no way to avoid that initial pain period of like investing or transition before things begin to bear fruit. I think that will is there, but it's going to be one. I think it's one that is requires people from the community to make that presence known and form allyships with people inside these organizations that have these similar interests, but might not have the capacity or the time or the resources to be doing those things.
And Representative Miranda, you talked about the legislature needing to hold the executive branch accountable for fulfilling the data collection aspects of this bill. What should the legislature do? What are you going to do? And how do you balance using your political capital to advocate for data reform versus pushing for other things like, more funding for criminal justice programs or other steps that could really address the disparities?
Thank you for asking me. I have a couple of things to say, actually four. When Undersecretary Collins was speaking about governance, it really made me think about when we're elected by the people to serve out and represent them. One of the things that we have to take into consideration is that there are thousands of people in the care and custody of the Commonwealth. When they interact with our courts, they're dealing with the legislature. When they interact with our DOC system, they're interacting also with the legislature, because we are the people who do the statutes and mandates to ensure that our Commonwealth is a just society. And so this is also an issue of governance and prioritizing what is important to us. What we do not fund is not a priority to us. What we do not hold accountable or leave to be transparent is not a priority to us. And here's the deal. The deal is that the data is going to tell us bad news, right? The data always tells us bad news because we have a huge crisis and problem here in the Commonwealth. And I think part of the problem is that Massachusetts has an identity crisis. It loves to tell people how liberal it is, but the truth is when it comes to criminal justice, it is not. When you look at life without parole, you look at 1 in 6 people in our DOC system are serving life without parole. We're second to Louisiana in this country. Second to Louisiana. We're not second to Louisiana in anything. And disproportionate numbers are young people who entered the system, got life without parole as juveniles, and are in our prisons essentially rotting to die. And so what I'm planning on doing, and I'm sorry I'm getting a little bit emotional, but this is a life or death issue. I mean, we're talking about data, but data can be a weapon. And I think the lack of data collection has been weaponized and colonized, and it's really hurting our communities. And we don't realize that because we're not measuring this data, it's not just about numbers on a paper or making things digital just to make things more effective and efficient, but there is a human toll to this. And the human toll are our brothers and sisters and our parents and people who are incarcerated due to the lack of agency and political will that I think the legislature needs. And so I'll give an example of what I'm planning on doing. DA Rollins mentioned parole. I have filed and will file 3 bills, one to end life without parole, one to deal with technical violations, and the third, which I actually think is incredibly important, is to reform the parole board. We need different people on this parole board because we need to be thinking about setting people free, not keeping people caged up in our system. The last is the other set of bills around juvenile justice, because interactions, and as Felix said, that's really important. We are more likely to interact with police. That means we interact more with the criminal justice system and the courts. And we see that when we interact with police and when we interact with courts, we are going to jail more, we are staying in jail longer. And if we really want to address mass incarceration, we have to go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem, you were right, Felix, isn't really about criminal justice, it's about poverty. It's about racial injustice. It's about the lack of housing and mental health and dealing with addiction in a different way so that people are not ending up in our prison system that literally just need help. And lastly, I'll say, we got to put our money where our mouth is. You know, we have to prioritize the funding for the comprehensive data collection. And we also have to hire well. And what I'm saying by hire well is we cannot continue to hire the companies that are giving us the data that is not going to be helpful. And so we need to be creative and innovative and expansive in thinking about, are we hiring people? Are we putting our money, our valuable millions and millions of dollars in our state coffers to make sure that we have companies that have a racial equity lens to begin with? Because if they do not, they're going to collect the data or they're going to create the systems that have unintended consequences. And I don't want to see that happen. But I will say and end that I feel like there's a fever in the legislature right now. We just passed policing reform. We passed the Roe Act. If there was a time that I felt more hopeful about things getting done and getting done quickly, it's under the leadership of Speaker Mariano and the Black and Latino caucus, who is pushing on this because we cannot wait any longer. We can't wait. We can't afford to.
And Undersecretary Collins, I'd like to bring you back in here. First of all, I just want to give you the opportunity to respond to some of what you've heard. But also, you're talking here, you have a passionate legislator, you have a lot of advocates watching this. What do you need in order to do your job and build out these systems? Do you need more funding? Do you need more information? What is it?
Sarah, and everything that's been said today goes back to what we need, which is good data. And that's what we're working towards. And this is a top priority. And the top priority started with the formation of the underpinnings of how are we getting this data. And I say that in the sense that we worked early on with the trial court to establish a system by which the trial court is able to get that unique identifying number, that SID, to put into their court records early on. That was one part of the criminal justice reform that EOPS worked with the trial court to establish. So that is already in place. We're building off of that foundation for this cross-tracking system. Also, NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, that was also part of the criminal justice reform that EOPS worked to put on mass.gov. So you can go on to mass.gov and see the crimes that are being committed, the types of crimes in the cities and towns. So when I say that, that does not replace the fact that we don't have a cross-tracking system, and that's not my goal in saying that. But I want this community to know, and I want everybody to know, that this is important. And this is a very long process. So we have to start with figuring out what we can build off of, which we've started, how we get the quality data. So Shira, when you say, well, what can we do or what can be done? Well, the first thing is to identify how do we get that quality data? And that's what we're doing. We're meeting with the trial court. When I say we, meaning I have folks from the State Police Identification Unit and the trial court and my office meeting with the trial court. Now, remember, the Harvard study talked a lot about the quality of data that was lacking. And that's the point of meeting with the trial court, is to establish how do we get that good quality data? Because the trial court has the data from the police departments. How do we get that into our cross-tracking system? How do we get that unique identifying number? It would be helpful if that were something that were required. And it is required in the cross-tracking system, but it's not the law that everybody be fingerprinted when they are charged with a crime. So that's going to be a difficult hurdle to overcome. So the steps that we've taken thus far have gotten us to the point where we are ready to promulgate our regulations. We have also met with companies that the state has not dealt with for data collection. And we're looking at innovative ways to collect that data. We're not relying upon the companies we've used in the past. We are trying to be innovative because we know, Secretary Turco knows, this is so important. We cannot just go with what we've been doing before. We need to do better. We understand that. We want to do better. The light has to be shown on this data. Folks need to know what is happening. And we appreciate that, and we know that, and we want this state to have good data. And we are trying innovative ways to get it. We are talking to anybody we can. I have personally reached out to folks from every aspect to say, how do we get this data? How do we make this data good? How can we make this better? And yet we have to do better right now. And I know that. And I want this community to know that. Representative Miranda, everything you've said, absolutely, we have taken to heart, and we are working towards that. The time is now. You're absolutely right. And we are working to get that done. This is a tremendous effort that I understand we need to do better, and we will. Thank you.
Dr. Rabinowitz, you've heard all of this about Massachusetts today. What can we learn as we're going to implement this new system? What can we learn from other states?
Wow, that's a great question. And I think, to be honest, all of the states that are doing this are really struggling with a lot of the same issues. I think the key lessons are really about the resources, thinking about resources, obviously in terms of technology, but also just in terms of human beings. So the ability of a state system to collect and match and make usable data from all of the local agencies is really dependent on the buy-in from those local agencies. And that buy-in means not just the leaders of those agencies, but actually the individual attorneys, police officers, court clerks, et cetera, who are actually doing the day-to-day data entry and ensuring that they can build that into their business processes. I think part of getting that buy-in from them is to one of your earlier questions, really help ensuring that they see the benefits of the data so that the data are useful to them, help those agencies make the kinds of policy decisions that they don't currently have the data to make. And that's how you really get the buy-in from the people on the ground doing the data collection. And I think really having that iterative loop of how do we go from data collection to data analysis to actually lessons learned that can then be implemented at both the state and local levels is really critical for ensuring that that whole feedback loop and process from those individuals, those agencies, to ultimately the state researchers and back is really set up to work effectively.
Thank you. And before we conclude, I want to take one moment to just step back for a minute. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left and ask a final question to all of you. At this moment of real racial reckoning, it's clear that Massachusetts does have big problems with Black and Latino people, particularly men, being overrepresented in the prison system. We talked a lot about data, but either within that or beyond data, just in general, what is the biggest step in your mind that Massachusetts should take to address these racial disparities? I'm just going to go down the line, start with Felix, then Dr. Benowitz, Undersecretary Collins, and finally Rep. Miranda. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think data is very important. It's sort of what I work on and how I try to contribute to this effort. I don't think it is the be all and end all. I think as a researcher, I've looked at a lot of past literature on this. There's great ideas out there about ways that we can improve the system that I think we can start working on today, that we can start working on right now. And so I think don't let data paralyze us. I think that's going to be key to managing the process, but it is not key to starting the process. I think the most fundamental thing we can do right now is just drastically reduce the scope, like the net that is very wide right now of the criminal justice process. We can still take our public safety issues very seriously while addressing them through ways that don't create all the negative sort of side effects that incarceration and policing do in our communities. So I think we can just take a lot of kinds of public safety concerns entirely out of the realm of criminal justice. And we do that for some populations more than others. We recognize that there's better ways than incarceration to help people deal with their problems for some communities more than others, right? So I'm not here to try and say we need to punish equally across races. I think we need to be using punishment less, and then the racial disparity in it will become moot for a lot of these things, right? So I think we need to just think more broadly and creatively about how we address our social problems and move things out of this space that has so many negative consequences that we spend years and years trying to deal with every time we double down on this approach to trying to solve our community problems.
Thanks. It's a great question. And I would largely echo what Felix has said, which is first and foremost, this is not a data problem. So data can identify places where we can make interventions, but ultimately this is a policy and practice problem. And all of the data in the world is not going to fix this if we don't actually commit to policy and practice interventions. With that said, I think you have to start as upstream as possible. People think of upstream often as being policing and law enforcement, and I certainly think that's true, but I think really upstream is law and legislation. So why do we have so many laws that criminalize so many parts, so many basic aspects of human conduct that need not be addressed through a criminal intervention? And then why are those forms of human conduct criminalized to such an excessive way that leads to such negative outcomes for humans, for communities, for society more generally? And so I think really thinking upstream about what it is that we want our criminal justice system to do and how the legislature can address that by reducing the use of criminal penalties for human conduct.
So you guys know politicians like to talk. So it was very hard when I'm listening to my colleagues and fellow folks to think about one thing. And I really think that it's three things. And I am a legislator, so I heard everything that the doctor said. And what's important for me is for us to look at racial equity in all of our policy making and actually go a step further and to look at an anti-racist model. We have been passing laws since 1636 in the state of Massachusetts. The founding of this Commonwealth led to the founding of all the other colonies. A lot of the bedrock and the antiquated laws and the systems that basically held up white land-owning Protestant men are still in effect. And we look very different. We have a different Commonwealth, we have a different country, and we have to begin to look at race in anything and everything and all things. So that's the first thing. The second thing, when you talk about where does this begin in the problems? But eradicating poverty, I think for me, is the Commonwealth being more honest that we have 1 in 20 people here in the state of Massachusetts who are millionaires. But we have lots of poor people. We have gateway cities and majority minority districts, 20 of them, where there's English isolation and there's deep, deep, deep poverty. And we're ignoring that situation. And I think this year and this term would be a great opportunity to look at the racial implications in our economics and our capitalist systems and look at Massachusetts. And it's not just a one-time thing, right? If you do something repeatedly and it's ingrained and embedded in you, then you can actually accomplish something. This is not about just creating more laws or doing more task forces, reports, and working groups and commissions, since we love them so much. This is really about taking a step back to look at our state and say, as the 200 senators and the representatives who represent the 351 towns here in Massachusetts, towns and cities, are we doing what is morally right and just to improve the quality of life for every Massachusetts resident? And I beg of us to look into that. And I know that I'm taking away from this call, from all these reports, from the people tweeting me right now, that the commitment has to be there, not just for me, not just for the people who believe in progressive values, but for each and every legislator and the governor and his secretaries and his cabinets to really look at justice differently. We can't go back to normal. COVID has taught us that there's no normal, right? We're not going backwards, we're going forward. So thank you.
Transparency. That's what's important. And that's what needs to happen is transparency. That's what good data is going to give this state, is the transparency that is needed to understand what the criminal justice system is doing, how it operates, and how it can be better served, how the citizens of the state can be better served. And that's the purpose of good data. And what does it mean to get good data is very difficult at many times, as we've talked about today, because there's different definitions for different ways to collect data and how we can do it. But if we start with the sole purpose of transparency and understanding how important it is, that the criminal justice agencies, they want transparency, they want to do a good job, and this state needs transparency with this data. And so one of the challenges to getting good data is to understand how to collect it and what does it mean. And so I would leave this meeting by saying that the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security is invested in good data. We want to give you good data and we want transparency. And that's what we're working hard to do. And I appreciate this time and thank you very much.
And thank you all so much for this really enlightening and fascinating conversation. We've all learned a lot from all of you. So thank you very much. And Greg, back to you.
Thanks, Shira. Thanks so much. Pretty amazing conversation. Want to thank all of our panelists, Representative Miranda, Felix, Michaela, Undersecretary Collins. Thank you for bringing that very important perspective that you brought to this critically urgent issue. We really appreciate your time and your interest. Thank you for being with us today. Now, Shira, I want to thank you too for leading us through the conversation. It's not easy to facilitate Zoom panels. So great job. Really want to thank you for doing that. In wrapping up, I also want to thank our sponsors once again, the Shaw Foundation, the Boston Foundation, Community Resource for Justice, and Al-Qaeda. They actually are the ones who make an event like this possible. And also want to thank Meredith St. Jean, who's in our control room and somehow managing to get us through this Zoom challenge. Meredith, great job. And finally, I hope that all of you will join us next Thursday on February 11th for part 2 of our criminal justice event, Refunding Corrections. We'll turn our attention to the Department of Corrections and County Corrections. Now, MassINC staff is now adding the link to register for that event in the chat. So thanks for joining us today. Hope to see you there next week. And in the meantime, stay safe out there, everybody, and have a great day. Thank you for joining us.